Number 1. In August, I moved into my first apartment. I graduated from university, was offered a job as a teacher, and was well on my way to figuring out this whole adult life. I moved in with a longtime friend, and neither of us had any complaints about our apartment complex. Our complex is very nice. It's not in a wonderful part of town, but it's truly a diamond in the rough. The complex is well maintained, clean, and the other members have been nothing but friendly. To get into our complex, there are 2 gates. If you live at the apartments, you are given a remote that opens the gate of your choosing. But if you don't live at the complex, you have to go through a directory at the front to find the name of the resident you are looking for. Once you have found the resident's name, it appears as last name, first initial. It calls the resident's phone and gives the resident a few options. The resident can choose to talk to the person who has called them and decide to let them in by entering in their key code into the dial part of their cell phone, or they can hang up and the gates will not be opened. Overall, I think this system helped to save me from the situation I got myself into. One night in October, I was driving home from my fiancé's house. It was late at night, probably close to 2 a.m. I had just gotten off of the freeway and was about to enter into my neighborhood when I was stopped at a traffic light. I was in the left-hand turn lane, and there was another car in the right-hand turn lane 2 lanes away from me. The light changed to a green arrow, and I proceeded to turn left, and the car, which had previously been in the right-hand turn lane, maneuvered to follow me. I thought this was weird because of how many lanes they cut across, but I figured they were lost, so I tried not to think much of it. I continued driving down the road and was about to make a right-hand turn into my neighborhood and was distressed to see the car turn in behind me. Still, I ignored my gut feeling and figured they lived in the neighborhood around my complex. I remember thinking that they were driving just a little bit too close, but again, I tried not to let my anxiety get the best of me. I do have high anxiety, so I figured it was just my brain playing tricks on me. I remember from reading stories on here that the best way to tell if someone is following you is by turning right multiple times to form a square of sorts. I talked myself out of this maneuver. I wish I hadn't. I sped up just a bit, clicked my gate open, and pulled into the complex. The car following me whipped in right behind me. Again, I convinced myself that this was normal. They probably lived in the complex too, right? The gate opens up on the opposite side of the apartments, so you have to drive through the entire complex to get where my apartment is. I drove through quickly. I was prepared to exit the complex just in case the person was still following me, but when I looked at the straightaway right behind me, I realized that there weren't any headlights following anymore. I laughed at myself for being so nervous and pulled into my parking spot in front of my building. As I parked and prepared to get out of the car, I turned for one last look and realized that the car that had been following me had reappeared with their headlights off, and they parked in an unreserved spot just a bit down from my own. I knew that I should have turned my car back on and drove away. I knew that there were so many other things I should have done, but in a moment of panic, I jumped out of my car and ran up the stairs and into my apartment. I double-locked the doors, grabbed a knife, and ran into my room to call my fiancé. I heard someone shouting from outside, which is very unlike my complex. It's very quiet. But I refused to listen to what they were saying as I told my fiancé what had just happened. I suddenly heard more voices shouting, and then it was silent. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. I remember not being able to stand because my knees were shaking so much, and I tried to stop myself from crying so I would be able to see if someone broke down my door. My fiancé made it to my apartment in record time with a baseball bat for me to help ease my mind. He stayed that night and let me sleep with the lights on. I couldn't get the sound of the screaming out of my head. It was obvious they were calling for someone, and I figured it must have been me. I assumed the other person screaming must have been another resident who was trying to make the other person be quiet during the early morning hours. I figured the whole situation was over until I woke up in the morning. When I walked downstairs to my car, I discovered that one of my tires had been viciously slashed to ribbons. I then realized that I had left some mail with my name on it in my car in a hurry to exit the night before. I didn't think much of that detail until later. I got my tire fixed and tried to push that night out of my mind. A few days later, however, I started to receive calls from the directory in front of my building to let someone in. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I answered and asked who was calling for me. I was met with silence, so I hung up and didn't grant access to the complex. Again, I was called, and the same procedure was repeated. Again, no one answered. They called obsessively from the call box directly for days. I finally snapped into the phone for them to tell me who they were, and a man answered. He told me that he lived in the complex and needed to be let in because he lost his key. He told me he lived in the apartment next to me. I knew the family who lived next to me. There was a woman with 4 children, but no man. And if he really did live there and lost his key, he would have been able to call himself to open the gate. I told him I didn't believe him and hung up just as he started screaming at me to let him in. The calls continued. Finally, I had enough. I marched to the office the next day and asked them to take my number off the directory. The man was unable to call me now, and I felt at peace. I warned the office about the man who had damaged my car, and they increased security rounds in the complex for a few months. As anticlimactic as it is, that was the last contact I had with the weirdo, thankfully. I know how I handled the situation by not listening to my gut when it told me something was wrong, got me into trouble. I allowed someone to follow me and learn my name, and they were able to torment me for a few weeks before I finally took action. I am just thankful to my fiancé and the staff at my apartment for taking action to help me stop the creep from being able to contact me. Number 2. A little bit of context just so everyone can get a bit more understanding. I live in Vietnam, deep inside a long lane in an area known to have a lot of Westerners. I'm a 5'7", chubby Eurasian female who's unfortunately got what is often known as childbearing hips. I take the bicycle to and from school since it's so close, and regardless of my size, it's obvious that I am a student from my uniform. Bear with me in this story, as this was about 2 years ago, and the exact details are a bit fuzzy. I was biking back home from school today when I heard a motorbike behind me, so I moved to the side to allow them to pass. The rider, an old, fat Vietnamese man, instead of driving past, drove side by side to me and tutted,
"Aren't you really fat?"
Of course, living in a culture where straightforwardness was expected, I simply smiled sheepishly and said, "Duh," a polite way of saying yes, and carried on biking home, relieved when he turned on the next lane. I didn't mention it to my parents, but my friends and I did moan about how rude people could be. I brushed it off as just another asshole who was inputting comment where it was unwanted. It wasn't until a week later when the same thing happened again. Biking my way home on the same lane, he rolled up beside me, looking me up and down, and again tutted about my weight. This time, he mentioned my legs and my hips and asked me why I was so fat. Due to my being very conscious about those particular areas, I didn't think in any shape or form that the comment was lecherous, and instead just apologized for my weight and laughed weakly. He tutted again, but drove off nonetheless. Once again, this was not mentioned to my parents, as naive teenage me didn't think that this man was following or sexually harassing me. I'm a very trusting person, as well as a huge people please. I've a near phobia of going against someone, so naturally I just assumed he lived in the area and that he probably thought he was helping me lose weight by shaming me for being overweight. Note, that is quite typical reasoning here. And wouldn't you know, he appeared again a few days later. This time he didn't say anything, and instead just drove behind me. I myself didn't realize this, not even bothering to look back, as I simply thought it was just one of my neighbors or the like, so I biked right up to my front gate. Yes, you may scream at my naivete all you like. As I stopped in front of my gate, I was surprised to see the same man drive past me and thought, no wonder I keep seeing him. He must be a neighbor. So imagine my utter confusion, followed by fear, when he turned his bike around and drove back down the other way. I berated myself endlessly afterwards. I had just revealed where I lived. Despite all this, I said nothing to my parents, having faith that this man was simply just a nearby resident and that he really meant no harm. Lo and behold, I saw him again a couple of days later. This time, I knew not to drive straight home and turned down one of the lanes instead, stopping in front of a house that I knew was up for rent, but did not have any residents. "Me oi, mother," I called, hoping that I could trick him into thinking I actually lived there. He drove past me, and once I was sure he was gone, I headed back to my real home. This continued to happen every day for a week, with him sometimes making comments and sometimes not. Not even my friends knew of this now. It wasn't until one day, when everything was going as usual, when he changed it up, saying,
You're just fat all over. Beautifully fat arse, beautifully fat tits.
He then reached over and squeezed my left breast really hard while making that weird kissing gesture guys do on the streets. Yes, I'm dense, but even I knew at this point that this man was not simply fat-shaming me. His eyes and his hand were glued to my breasts, not even on the road where they should be. And although I said before that I am a people please and really try to avoid confrontation, I know when I should do something. Wielding my helmet, I shouted, "Do you want me to hit you with my helmet?" Terrifying, I know. He just laughed at me before diving off again, and this time I did tell my parents. Of course, they were furious with me, but told me to go home as soon as possible next time. The next day, he came again, as expected, and per my parents' instructions, I dashed home, not even caring he would now definitely know where I lived if he didn't before. I was already shouting for my dad before I'd gotten in the door, and he jumped on his motorbike and raced out. I was sitting with my mom when he came back, and he told me that he'd chased the man all the way down to the top of the lane, screaming that if he ever got near me again, he'd punch his teeth in. It's been 2 years since then, and although I've had another encounter with a different creep, I have never caught sight of this man again. I assure you, though, that next time I won't hesitate to send a hard helmet into his face. Number 3. It was the night of prom, and me and about 5 other girls, all around 17, 18, pretty much all black, had left the venue and were driving around aimlessly, hoping to catch a party to go to. Every place we went to ended up being a bust or getting busted by cops, So we were heading to go hang out with some friends around 2-3 a.m. It's important to note that none of us were inebriated in any manner. So by this time of the night, the roads were almost completely empty. We live in rural, suburban Northern Virginia, and it's incredibly dark as the car had broken high beams. The driver, Key, made a turn down a road and, seeing as it was incredibly dark, briefly drove in the wrong lane, no divider. It only lasted around 5 seconds or so, and absolutely no one was on the street, so she just calmly corrected herself. Right as she makes it to the correct lane, a car about 50 to 100 feet behind us turns on his headlights and lays on the horn. It seemed like this guy appeared out of nowhere, and I found it incredibly strange that he didn't have his headlights on, as it was a new moon and almost completely dark. So she waves her hand out of the window and says sorry, but the guy was just not having it. He immediately sped up, riding our tail and honking almost constantly, to the point we were going around 60 in a 30 zone. He was in a huge black truck, waving a Confederate flag out of the back, and we were in a tiny green Kia, so we were understandably terrified. He ended up actually ramming our bumper a few times, although not enough to dent the car or move it, thankfully. We're debating what to do, whether we should call the cops or not, when Key takes a few sharp turns and ends up losing the guy to stop in a parking lot. We wait super quietly under this shady tree, ready to drive off or call the police, or both, for a few minutes. One of my friends suddenly notices his truck parked a few parking lots away, separated by a few trees, in a way that we can see him, but we were hoping he couldn't see us. I don't have the best eyesight, but even I could see him jump out of the car. This guy was massive, wide and tall, holding something in his arms and waving it around. Another friend with more gun experience than I points out it looks like it could be a shotgun. We watch for a few seconds, paralyzed in fear, as he yells something along the lines of,
"Y'all come out now!"
After we all wised up, Key put the car into drive and sped out of that parking lot as fast as she could. We were visibly shaken and immediately went home so we could safely freak out, making sure to see if he was following us the whole way. Number 4. This happened to me in 2012, and I still have intense PTSD over it. When I was younger, I had a pretty bad drug problem, but went to rehab and got clean through Narcotics Anonymous meetings. Now, anyone familiar with these meetings know that there are two main kinds of people there. People who want to be there, and people who are forced to be there. It's pretty obvious just by looking and listening who is who. There is also an endless parade of people who come to meetings and never come again. Sadly, it's the nature of addiction. There was this one guy, however, that always creeped me out. His name was Brent. Whenever we would smoke outside before leaving the meetings, he would inch his way closer to me and then jump into whatever conversation I was a part of. This didn't weird me out until later on. I had friends telling me he was asking them really weird things about me. Things like, did I have a boyfriend? I am a lesbian. Did I live close? Where did I work? Etc. Before I could even confront him about these weird questions, he just stopped showing up. At the time, I felt relieved. Fast forward to a year later, while I was still going to meetings, I didn't go as often because I worked full-time at a pizza place. I just worked at the counter, but we all wore the same uniform from delivery to the cooks to the counter. One night, I got off work and stopped at a gas station on the way home to get cigarettes. As I'm walking out, I feel a weird chill, but brush it off quickly. even though it was July in Florida. I was too tired to be worried about it. I pulled into a long road that takes me to my street, about 2 miles, and rolled down the window to light a cigarette. An SUV pulls up behind me and starts flashing its brights at me and honking. I honestly thought it was my brother, seeing as he lived 2 streets over and constantly did stuff like this. As I pulled into my driveway, the SUV pulled into the grass, again, right where my brother always parked, so I paid no attention and continued smoking and being slow as humanly possible to get out of the car. As I am about to grab my things and get out, a guy walks up to the window and says,
"Give me everything you have."
It's important to add, he also had one hand behind his back. I just stared at him and literally replied, "Is this real life?" He then thrust his arm into the opening in my window and started grabbing at me. He was grabbing furiously at anything or any part of me he could get his hands on. He grabbed my hoodie and started banging my head against the window, yelling at me to open the door. I just remember screaming and honking my horn as much as possible as my parents were inside. I had my phone in my right hand, and every time I pulled it out to dial my parents, he kept reaching for it. After what seemed like forever, but in reality was probably only 2 minutes, my mom came running outside, yelling, and he booked it out of there. When I finally calmed down enough to talk, the police showed up. Asking the usual questions, they asked if I knew him or if he looked familiar. I have Asperger's, so I have awful facial blindness, but something about him seemed familiar. I told him that, while I could be wrong, I thought it was Brent, the creep from Narcotics Anonymous. They found him not even 10 minutes later, speeding away from the direction of my house. Apparently, he was out of his mind on drugs, but that still will never excuse his actions. I've included a link to the article written about it below. Edit. One reporter came and spoke to me, got it wrong. I never said kids, and it was my mother who came outside. I have no reason to lie, and every article would say the same thing, because they all got it from one reporter. I blacked out details of my name and identifying factors of where I live. After I blacked everything out, it wasn't as obvious, but Brent was the one who attempted to rob me. Creepy Mina here of the WorstNightmare channel. I hope you enjoyed those 4 stories of women being followed. If you are ever followed, drive to the nearest police station, and that is a good way to stay safe. So, we'll cut to the chase. Comment below. Have you ever been followed, either on foot, in a car, on a bike? Let us know. Give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe if you haven't already. Share on your favorite social networking platform. Follow me on Twitter as WorstNightmare6 for advance notice of all uploaded videos. And please do stay safe.